Doctor Group State of the Nation, episode 8. So this is our 8th edition of our webinar, welcoming you to talk about what's been happening in retail, both globally and across Australia. So this morning, just a couple of things. If you do have any questions, you can raise them in the Q&A function through Zoom, and we will either ask them during the session or we are going to hold a Q&A at the very end. So we welcome all the questions to come through for our panelists towards the end. And we will aim to wrap up by 10 a.m. The copy of the content also will be available. So if you do need to leave early, there will be a recording available and it will be emailed out to all participants later today. Fantastic. So firstly, I would like to welcome Brian Walker, CEO and founder of Retail Doctor Group.
Good morning, everyone. Delighted to be here. And as Anastasia says, State of the Nation, number 8. And what a year. I'm delighted this morning to be joined by Paul Zahra. Paul, of course, is the CEO of the Australian Retailers Association. Paul is CEO, non-executive director, and many of us would know Paul for his great work, certainly as a diversity advocate, certainly as ex-CEO of David Jones, and some very senior roles in retailers across the country, previously including Officeworks and Target. So Paul will bring a really unique and valuable contribution. So thank you for being with us, Paul. Equally, we'll also have Derek Wyllie with us. Derek is the Commercial Director, Australia Pacific for Doc Martens, and particularly interested with Derek's help in what's going on in the region and how he sees the market shaping up as well. And for those who know us well, we do a lot of work in consumer and market insights. And today I'm particularly delighted to have Anastasia speak on some of the work we're doing in consumer trends, consumer sentiment, retailer sentiment, and how that's informing the strategy that no doubt will be touched on today. And Simon, grateful for Simon's time, Simon Fonteyn, Managing Director, certainly Leasing and Property update, and will provide a very valuable insight into the fast-moving, changing retail property landscape. So, Anastasia, I'll pass back to you with our thanks.
Thanks, Brian. So I am just going to give a bit of an update as we approach the end of 2020, and we're kind of 7 to 8 months through the pandemic now, and the questions we keep getting asked is, how has consumer behaviour changed? And more importantly, are we going to expect to see these changes stick? What do we expect to see as we move forward? Will things go back to usual, or is there going to be a new normal? So I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the trends. And at Retail Doctor Group, we've conducted various pulse surveys with consumers throughout COVID. So we're going to just talk a little bit about some of the updates that we've had recently and what we are seeing. So we're just going to start off with the 4 big consumer trends that we kind of are predicting to continue into 2021. So firstly, the rise of convenience. So what COVID has brought to the market is this convenience. Consumers can get everything whenever they want, wherever they want, at whatever time they want. So we're seeing the rise of click and collect. We're seeing the rise of food deliveries, grocery deliveries, any form. You can have absolutely anything you want delivered to your house at any time of the day. So this increased convenience, consumers have now got used to. So we're going to predict to see this trend moving forwards. And we'll talk a little bit more about each of these as we go through. Pre-research, so our customers are much more educated now. So COVID has taught them to pre-research before even leaving the house. So a little bit about what that means for retailers. Personalization, so very much still something that was really rising pre-COVID, and we have seen customers still demanding it. So personalized content, personalized communication, and personalized products. So it's not just purely creating products in the color and the style that a consumer wants, it's personalizing that whole consumer journey. And then experiential. And when we talk experiential now, this has been one of the major accelerants through COVID, is how we bring that experiential retail into the digital space as well. So consumers can experience the brand and keep really close to these retailers prior to setting foot in the physical store. And then how do we utilize that physical store to really create a meaningful experience for the customers? I'm just going to quickly touch through some of the research that we've done and some of the numbers in the background to sort of back up what we're talking about, because anyone that knows me well knows that I am very much into the numbers and what that means. Okay, so firstly, convenience. So we recently did a global consumer study, so looking at all different consumers across the age brackets, and we asked the question, how important is it that stores save you time while shopping? Well, as you can see, a whopping 67% are saying that it's so important. And we've seen this accelerate even further due to COVID. In particular, our younger demographics, our millennials, our Gen Z, 75%. So 3/4 of them are saying, I want retailers to save me time. Don't mess me around, get to the point. So a bit of a phrase I like to use, time is a currency. So customers are really looking for this frictionless experience. What can make it easier? So we've seen that in the rise of click and collect. So our research shows 1 in 3 have used it in the last 12 months. Even higher, 1 in 5 have used it in the last month. And the stat is lower, but it's a higher frequency. So we can see people are really using it often, and it's getting embedded into their lifestyles. We've seen Dan Murphy offering click and collect where it comes into your boot. You don't even have to leave the car. Bunnings offering it, priority parking, click and collect, the order's ready. So customers are really experiencing how they can get things quicker.
When we work with our clients, we're always looking at this time well saved, time well spent in the retailer's offer to support what Anastasia is saying. And so time as the currency is one of the key takeouts to think about and have great insights into your consumer and the way that they want to do business with you.
Definitely, yeah. So time is key. And then we move a little bit to how purchase locations are changing as well. And this again is emphasizing this convenience that customers are looking for. So as obviously we would imagine, consumers are moving towards localized shopping. So very much around local strip malls, standalone stores, what's close to them. And again, for that convenience, they're not willing to travel anymore. And as Brian touched on, COVID has even emphasized more how consumers use their time. And they're now thinking, well, actually, there's better ways to use my time and more valuable ways. So what can give? And we can see this by this move towards localized shops. But I do say again, it's dependent on what they're looking for and this gap between convenience and experiential. So we're seeing it move even further. But if they're looking for that experience and they're leaving the house for the retail experience, they are more prepared to travel to further away. We have seen the rise of subscription services. So this was something that we all know was on the grow pre-COVID, and this has been accelerated massively during COVID. And I think what we're going to see as well is consumers, again, have gotten used to it and it has become part of their lives. So we can see 20% are now using grocery subscription services. So this is Woolworths and Coles, getting them delivered to their door. And they've purchased subscriptions. So that's what we're seeing here, an actual purchase of a subscription. So that's when we know it's going to be long-term. 30% now purchasing music subscriptions and a whopping 60% purchasing Netflix and Stan and similar TV streaming. And if we look at the difference between the demographics, we can really see that our millennials and Gen Z are really leading the way. So 73% already subscribing to a TV streaming service.
In the US, it's 85%, and so we're fast gaining to that track. And here, you see one of the secrets to the Amazonian model. It's linked to Prime, it's linked to web engine services. For a different topic for a different day, but you certainly do understand that model. And pay TV is key. In fact, it's greater rate of time used than free-to-air TV, certainly in the UK, and soon to be here, I suspect.
Definitely, and I'm actually, yeah, we're going to touch on that in a second. We can have a look at the detail, and I suppose this quickly touches on how we're changing the way we shop and utilising these things we call marketplaces. And we can see here, this was the use of Amazon. So 19%, so 1 in 5 have used Amazon in the last 12 months. and 46% have used eBay in the last 12 months. So we really are seeing that shift of consumers now shopping a different path to purchase. And when we kind of look at what are the sectors, so we can see books, magazines, clothing, accessories, electronics, homewares, as we would kind of expect. So we've seen a slight shift, pet care, stationery, moving slightly more during COVID as well. So we can see those spikes of the sectors that have picked up.
One of the comments about the Amazonian growth, of course, that it was a little bit understated in Australia, and Anastasia will touch on this. It's interesting, Amazon have 13% of the global online market at the moment. And when you take both Alibaba's companies and Amazon, you have 40% of the global online market, just in those two companies. So an extraordinarily fragmented play in online marketplaces below that. And online, full stop.
Online, full stop. And this was, again, sort of touching back to what Brian was mentioning. So we did break it down, and this is where we do touch on Amazon, and we look, and I think it has been one of the key drivers during COVID for retailers for that end fulfillment. So I think that's why we've seen this rise. So when we look at Amazon Prime, which for those that don't know, which I'm sure we all do, the subscription model offers free delivery, and it's a TV streaming platform and a music streaming and a computer game streaming. So for a one-off fee, you get all of these items. And we can see that increase. So pre-COVID, last year, 7% of the population were Prime members. So that's paying for Prime. And that now has jumped to 17%. So this convenience, I get all my food delivered. When you're a Prime member, you can order anything, whether it's a pack of toilet roll, all the way up to electronics, books, and they'll deliver it free. So I think what consumers are moving towards is this convenience, no minimum spend. I can have what I want when I want. And we can see there as well, Amazon doing very well with its consideration. So 19% of the population considering. We've seen a few new players come in. So Disney Plus gaining quick market share from Foxtel. So we can see, and this is, I suppose, what Brian was saying regarding the traditional TV really reducing. So we can see the rise of Netflix and Stan, Netflix at 50%. So really taking market share. The growth of Coles and Woolworths, and they're really people really considering. So 1 in 5 would consider, and 15% have already got one or the other of these delivery platforms. So when we look at this, as a whole, we're seeing around a fifth of the population having these grocery delivery platforms.
And the reason we make these points is that Amazon Prime, for example, in the US, is 55% of all the population in the United States have Prime, critical to the Amazonian growth model, and really emphasizing this deep divide occurring between buying and shopping. And we consider this to be the influencers and in turn the buying channel, and shopping, of course, is experiential retail. But no great secrets that we see this great transformation in the marketplace. And this is the underlying foundation of the change.
Yeah, I think without a doubt, it really is separating this buying and shopping, which we touched on in our 4 trends. And this divide is growing further and further. And this is one of the things that COVID has really accelerated, this transactional shopping through these delivery platforms. Pre-research, so we've got a more educated consumer, even more than we had 6 months ago. And we're seeing this in stores, so, lower level of footfall, but increased purchase and conversion. So customers are arriving at the store and they know what they want. And we're very much seeing this now influencing every aspect of the customer's purchase journey. So I think one of the key things is this customer purchase journey is changing rapidly. So have a look at that. How do your customers interact? What touch points do they use? This increase in streaming service alone is showing us the change in the way that they utilize their technology and their devices. In excess of 4 hours a day on smartphones now. The real rise of e-commerce, takeoff of TikTok, all of these things really emphasizing this pre-research. So over 80% of retail purchases now pre-researched online with the mobile phone.
So if I may briefly, when we're working with clients, it's always about the precision of the channel mix It's the precision of this buying shopping mix, this integrated channel mix. It is certainly about having physical stores as the hub of the human experience, but then it's building this channel armory, which no doubt Paul and Derek will touch on, that's so critical to the mix.
Mm. And then just quickly, number 3, which is our personalization. So again, we see quite a large amount, 56% of consumers interested in personalization. And this is like what I was touching on, all parts of the journey. So this really links back into that customer journey. How do we personalize every touch point? And again, this is in both the transactional and the experiential. So the customers really feel connected to the brand, to the retailer, and they feel like it's about them. And then we move into experiential. And I think one of the things that I really want to touch on in experiential, it's now not just about the in-store, and it's really moving into this experiential online, and how this is then consummated in the physical store. So we know that consumers are humans that got emotions. The physical store is always going to be there. We've seen the rise of online during COVID. So, you know, around on average, rising from 9% to 15%. But the physical store is still going to be key for that customer experience. But how do we create the experience online that keeps us connected with those consumers, and then that draws them into the physical store as well? So just, I'm going to very quickly touch on 3 of the things that we have seen. So one phrase that I like to use here in the experiential is shoptimism. So this is something that's come out of COVID, shoptimism, the rise of small value purchases to feel good and evoke emotions. So consumers are moving into the stores to make these small value purchases. So we've been seeing this in the like of TK Maxx, Kmart, to really evoke these emotions and having that mini experience because they deserve it. So it's this shoptimism. And then how do we make that in-store experience worth leaving the house for? So if we're seeing the store footfall, consumers are wanting to leave the house, but now they think, well, we need a good reason. So what are these physical experiences that are needed to really draw these customers in? And then finally, how do we use the digital space? So we see now 63% of consumers are interested in using virtual reality, augmented reality in retail. And surprisingly, one of the things that we are seeing is this is across the demographics. This is not just our millennials, and it's the same goes for our online shopping. In all the research that we've done, we really have seen it across the board in our demographics, an increase in all of the groups using these digital platforms. So just in the essence of time, I'm just going to really quickly flick through these 3 in a bit more detail. So optimism, using retail therapy of low value items to evoke emotions of happiness and optimism. So as a retailer, how can we utilize this shoptimism trend, these items that are making us feel good, purchases that are not necessity purchases, but are really connecting with the customers? I thought this was a great example of a physical store creating that experience. Kit Kat Chocolaterie. So this opened in Sydney recently during COVID. Queues out the door, up the street, filling the whole shopping centre. And it's one of these things where we're going to see this move to in the future and future trends for customers looking for these experiences while shopping. It's something that's been building pre-COVID, but I think now consumers know that they can do their transactional shopping online. We're really seeing this growing divide between what I need for convenience, buying at my local mall, buying online, versus coming to these areas that are going to give me a full experience. And then how that then moves into the digital space. So I thought this was really interesting. Shopify showing that content with augmented reality, 94% higher conversion rate than products without AR. And this used to be a tech that we'd think of that was, 10 years ahead, it's futuristic, but we're seeing it come across all the different retailers now. So we really are seeing it come through. I mean, the likes of IKEA, who've been very good at this. Amazon have released Amazon Home, where you can put any of the items into your home space. We've now seen it come through fashion, so you can try on the clothes at home. beauty, you can put your lipstick on, test out the colours. I've even heard L'Oreal have released a filter that you can use on Zoom. So this use of augmented reality is really becoming every day. And this 4 hours that we have, in excess of 4 hours using our smartphones, show that customers are really wanting to connect through that device. So how do we create that experience? So just touching on to complete a few examples. So Gucci using it to try on trainers. So you can try on the shoes using your phone through Snapchat filters. Paul's using, again, Snapchat filter to try on your Levi's. So you can upload an avatar of yourself and then try on the different items of clothing. Burberry, this is using gamification and augmented reality you can pick your avatar, pick your skins, pick your items. And again, really creating this digital experience that draws people into the physical store.
I should also add, if I may, that augmented reality is a $500 million turnover industry, but growth at 300% plus. So certainly coming into the retailer armory, as Anastasia is saying.
Yeah, definitely. And this was a Miu Miu campaign, which I thought was very interesting. It was the second one that Miu Miu have done. And it was creating a digital arcade game, so gamification online using augmented reality, but it was to advertise their perfume. So again, it was advertising one of their products, but it was creating this augmented reality in this game for customers to play online before they then physically purchase the product. And another one that's just launched recently, you can now buy cars online using augmented reality. So I thought this was really interesting. It's not just still the lower end side of the market, so your fashion and your beauty. It's moving right the way up the scale now to these bigger value purchases where you can sit in the car, you can look at all the aspects, you can actually take a picture of your driveway and have the car sat on your driveway to see which one looks good. So I think it's really interesting to show how it's coming through all aspects of retail. And then just to finish, just touching on a trend that I haven't put in my top 4 consumer trends for next year, but I think it's one that we're going to see return. So if you would have asked me pre-COVID what was the big consumer trend, I would have said sustainability. And then it did go a little bit quiet in the last few months. But I do predict that this is going to come back into the forefront, guns a-blazing next year, because we can see it was so this was some research that was conducted pre-COVID. 85% of consumers are looking for retailers that have got sustainability practices, 82% looking for social responsibility, and 81% transparency, business ethics. So it was right up there at the forefront of consumers' minds. And I think the one that was really interested, so 44% would choose to buy products from a company that aligns with their sustainability ethics rather than a competitor. So they are actually actively walking past other retailers to go to those that have got these sustainability. So one of the things I think we are going to see come back next year is this rise of sustainability. Fantastic. Well, thank you for listening. We will be sharing our consumer behaviour white paper in the next week, and happy to address any questions at the Q&A at the end. I've seen a few pop through. So very quickly, we will be also releasing a podcast. So if you're not yet subscribed to the Retail Doctor Group podcast channel, you can find us on Apple and Android. If you just search for Retail Doctor, you will find us.
Thanks very much, Anastasia. And I'll move quickly now to Paul. Paul Zahra, I've introduced earlier. Paul, welcome. We look forward to your perspective on retail, both nationally, boards, and through to some of the key areas that your association is working on.
Wonderful. And thanks, Brian, and thanks, Anastasia, for including me today. I really appreciate it. It's been hard pressed to get onto these infamous forums, so really pleased to be here. What I've been asked to talk about is just the sort of the top 3 things that are on people's minds and what I get asked about consistently. So just to give you a bit of background, those that don't know the ARA, it's the oldest and largest peak body industry for the retail industry, and we go from small mum and pa independents right up to Coles, Woolworths, Bunnings, Kmart, etc. So it's a really diverse group of retailers, which helps me to be really informed about what's going on in the industry, I guess. So whilst 95% of our businesses are small businesses, the 5% of the majors, majority are actually ARA members. So it sort of helps us with funding as a not-for-profit. So what's on most people's minds, what's happening in the industry, what's happening in Australian retailer and retail currently. And it's been a very interesting year to watch unfold. And I guess we've ended up with really a two-speed economy. That's the best way I can describe it to people. We've got the Australian marketplace, and then there's Victoria. So Australia's particularly been doing well. If you're following the numbers, those of you that are actually obviously open, if you're in tourism, you wouldn't be doing too well, but the majority of retailers have done particularly well through COVID. When you look at the industry, we've been in positive growth for the whole year, with WA being the standout performer, Victoria, of course, being a separate cutout, which I'll talk about shortly. From a category point of view, there are definitely winners and losers. So the winners have been anything in essentials that have been able to trade right through. So supermarkets, particularly food, beverages, pharmaceuticals. It sort of gives you a sense of how Australians are feeling right now. It's been predominantly liquor and drugs. But if you're in the clothing sector, of course, or in discretionary sector, that's been a little tougher because people have obviously working from home, have not been moving about, not been invited to events, which has meant that people have not had a need to really update their wardrobe. So if you think about men's suiting, women's after five, evening wear, those categories have done particularly poorly. Department stores have really, really suffered, of course, because their flagship locations are in the CBD, and CBD's particularly suffered. We see that Sydney might take 5 years before it actually recovers to its former glory. If you're in Melbourne, in a CBD location, what we've been told by the work that was done by PwC could take a decade to recover. So there's winners and losers between categories, but also locations. Now, CBDs are an interesting place to be because, of course, with the working from home, that has meant that all the city workers are actually shopping locally and shopping on their high street. And that's actually really hurt CBD locations. And of course, we don't have the tourism dollar. So tourists not coming in. Obviously, you have stores at airports that have actually been being closed, but equally, we don't have the intake of international tourists, which is about $60 billion a year. So we sort of got, again, winners and losers, but overall the market is doing particularly well. And Victoria, of course, opened their doors today. So it'll be a wait and see. You'd have to either think that there's a pent-up demand, which I think is what we'll find, or that those dollars were lost. But it'll take us a bit of time to recover in Victoria, because during that lockdown, particularly, there was something like 1,000 jobs a day that were lost, totaling about 220,000 jobs. If you're in the beauty industry, most of those beauty therapists are closed through the whole lockdown. It's been close to 9 months. Hairdressing equally have done it particularly tough because of they were the first to sort of be closed down after beauty. So again, winners and losers. And what has COVID done that's positive? So I try to look at positive things that may have come out of COVID. So what it has done is it actually accelerated trends, and by my estimation, about a decade's worth of trends that we'll see in the next couple of years. And they're already hitting us. Some of these trends, in fact, I imagined, but I didn't imagine would happen during my lifetime, are happening. So trends are really distilled from what Anastasia has mentioned. I would take it down to probably two main themes, which is convenience is a definite main theme, and under that comes personalization, subscriptions, etc. So there's been a major move to that type of thinking. For the very first time out of a recent Deloitte survey, convenience has outweighed price. So that's really good if you're, as a retailer, it's a good and a bad thing, because I think if you're paying for that convenience, you're wearing that cost, that's a problem, but it means that consumers are becoming less price sensitive, which I think is a real positive. The other big theme is, of course, contactless shopping. So we've become a little bit germophobic in our thinking, and rightly so, given that the start of a pandemic, or being through a pandemic. So imagine most of those trends that we've seen will be embedded in Australian culture. So one of the trends I mentioned that I thought I'd never see is the catalogue deliveries. So for the first time, we've seen Kmart, Coles, Woolworths come out and say they won't be distributing catalogues effective from a certain date. So that's this move to contactless shopping, all driven predominantly through digital the digital transformation of organisations. So you've got to be on that right side. You know, the two big advice I give to retailers, the first thing, reduce your physical footprint. The second thing is to actually invest heavily on digital. So be on the forefront of it. So again, when Anastasia talks about the augmented reality and all the different trends, you need to be across all of those trends, because they're no longer a trend, we're actually living them, and they're actually become our reality now. I've also been asked about what's on the board's mind. So what's on board's mind is more financial than it is about people, to be honest. So that sort of tells you many boards are actually are struggling with all the realities of being in a COVID way. And the biggest items come from things like leasing issues. So, and how do we actually renegotiate? I know you're going to have a session with Simon around leasing. So leasing is a big issue because there's been a major move from retailers to move to a more flexible rental proposition, which means that you're paying a percentage of rent as opposed to a fixed rent. So then the landlord is sharing in the upside of your business, but equally on the downside. So when we hit problems, both win and both lose during that period. And from what we know is that some retailers have been able to achieve this. So if you're achieving a percentage rent, that's really great. Landlords hate it, but retailers love it because it's actually means that you're sharing the risk. The other big issue, a big pain point for retailers that's on boards' minds is one about payroll. So payrolls have become a real focus because, of course, JobKeeper is about to taper off again. And equally, there are extra costs that retailers will be facing to remain COVID safe. So the big issue here, of course, is that whilst we believe sales will be fairly buoyant, in fact, in the next 3 months, we don't believe, we're remaining cautiously optimistic, but we believe, again, except for tourism, the general retail arena will do particularly well. There's this focus on cost because of the cost imposts that have been placed on business to trade through. The ARA, and I led this, was a big advocate for keeping job seeker in place, which is the social security aspect, because one thing I did learn about social security is that 58 cents of the dollar is actually spent in the retail economy. And we strongly believe we can't have an economic recovery without a retail recovery. So there's been a real focus from us on making sure that the poorest of the poor in our country actually are looked after. So assuming that doesn't happen, the plan is a job seeker goes back to $40 a day come December, which is in essence next month. And that will have an impact on the retail economy. So if you think about the future of the industry, I think we're not through the woods yet. I think we'll have a fairly good 3 months. Generally, as a retailer, again, there'll be winners and losers. But post that, the only number I probably would like to quote is that the government stimulus, and that's the only reason why we're doing well, by the way, not because of only our good work, is because of government stimulus, was equated to about $60 billion per quarter. Now that's about to end early next year and gets tapered off again post December. And the federal budget cuts that have come through, which we welcomed. So in that includes personal income tax reductions for low and middle class earners. They equate to about $3 to $4 billion. So we're going to go from $60 billion worth of stimulus to about $3 to $4 billion worth of stimulus. So there's a big difference between 60 and 3 to 4. So we will see that play out in our winter period next year. So something just to be mindful of, not to get too optimistic, because it is predominantly, take credit for your great work, but equally know that government stimulus had a big role to play. Those of you that were around the GFC, I remember it well, of course. You know, when Kevin Rudd had given everybody $1,000 stimulus, that had a major impact on the industry, and department stores didn't certainly see it, but discount department stores and supermarkets and essentials did see it. So this is a much bigger stimulus package than what happened back in the GFC period. So just something to be mindful of as we move into the new year. Just expect also to continue to think about your COVID safe plans, and they may have to play out again if there is potentially another third wave. So one of the other questions I often get is around leadership and what are my recommendations coming out of COVID. My recommendations are simply this. Crisis management is a skill set that all CEOs, all management require. It's no longer something that's just pulled out of a top drawer occasionally. If I think about my history, I've gone from a alleged sexual harassment claim to a bushfires to a pandemic to all sorts of crises. As part of life. As being in a senior management role, it's part of everything that we do is around having a crisis management plan. So that's important. So when things go wrong, you can work through that checklist fairly quickly. So it's really important that you think that through, particularly if there's another wave. We're advocating strongly for no further lockdowns, of course, because lockdowns shut the whole industry down. What we want to see is more of a hotspot approach, which is what New South Wales has successfully done in making sure that they could allow retailers to continue, but equally manage the health situation. So we do think, partly in our thinking was around, whilst I think Victoria got there and we're very grateful that they've got to 0 cases, that has come at a significant cost, financial health cost. We believe that most SMB, 50% of SMBs at least, SMB retailers won't survive through this pandemic. There's been many going into insolvency already, and equally mental health is a major issue in Victoria. It's up something like close to 35%. So there are other things to think about, financial health, mental health. So we really want to make sure that if we are in this position again, we're able to manage through some sort of hotspot perspective. So they're sort of the quick highlights. I wanted to also allow for some time. I know there's some questions that have come through that either you would like to ask me or that they may be on your mind that you want to explore further. So I'll just pause there, Brian, probably hand back to you if I may.
That's great, Paul. What a great summary, and thank you very much. One question, if I may, and then we'll pass to Anastasia with any Q&As there. When we're looking at Australian retail and thinking forward to the next 3 to 5 years, let's say the next 3 years, you see as the priorities 21 into 22 around some of the great topics you've talked about, around planning out, finding capital for infrastructure and so forth?
Look, I think when I look at the next few years, I'll come back to one thing, because I think that's really important people do take away. It's really important you understand, and I guess the biggest issue is about remodeling and reducing your physical footprint, because that's the biggest pain point is leases. So if you've got to be on that plan and understand that the world, as we're digitising, we need less space. We probably need bigger back rooms to deal with the logistics of getting a product out if you're fulfilling from a store. So just the skill set is quickly moving. When we think about the skill set in retail, it was very much about, during when I first started in the industry, and I won't tell you how long ago that was, it was very much about emotional intelligence and about actually, that connection with the customer. We've heard that so many times, but it's fast moved to a science. So it's much, much, much more scientific. The skill sets we'll need going forward to be much more about data, science, engineering. It's a completely different landscape. And, often, I get asked by the media a lot, because what we do is such a visual statement, because we're running shops. So they have these images, often, they'll try to catch me walking past a for lease sign, and that's what they're looking for. But of course, it's not that the industry is dead. It's just that there's a rebirth going on. And that's the way, it's a changing landscape. That's the best way for me to describe it, as people pivot to doing more digital, and as we become more about convenience. Click and collect has got the biggest trajectory, because people want to be able to purchase, not actually deal. In fact, the whole idea now is not to deal with a shop assistant. So that's something we have to get our heads around. That's part of the experience now, actually. And the only thing I just compare it to, Brian, is that if you remember, and you and I are old enough to know this, but we all, we think about banking. None of us want to deal with a teller. So we actually, the more investment in technology, the happier we are. That's the way the customer's thinking now. So yes, they'll want that connection, and yes, they'll want to be able to have face-to-face, but only if they can't get it any other way.
It's interesting, Paul, and I might pick up on, as we get involved in the whole neuroscientific world of limbic and so forth. We do know that, largely speaking, we're social by instinct.
Yes.
And so it's that lovely integration of the customer in control, isn't it? So you're absolutely right about the science. I think we would say that physical retail done well, and that's the big challenge, and thinking about curated experiences and thinking about physical space differently. As you point out, the dry store, as you know, training, education, all these human activities that you can't get elsewhere. But that's a challenge itself for retailers, because we're so caught in the maxim of space equals stock equals rent equals sales.
And, you know, there'll be a digital solution where we'll be able to, at some point, know when Madam walks into the store, what she's looking for and what's on her. We won't have to ask. So that will be, again, something that will happen in our time because of the fast moving aspect of digital and how things are, information sharing is just moving so quickly. We'll know enough about the customer to understand how we can recommend things to her. And of course, it's in retailers interesting to move as much online as possible, because in fact, arguably we get such a rich data set that we don't get in a physical store today that allows us to give a better service experience. So I'm definitely not down on physical stores. It's really, really important. I'm not a big advocate for pure play. In fact, my view is that you've got to be in every channel, but it realizes there's an opportunity for pure players from a startup point of view to be there. But equally, the physical store is becoming more and more challenging as customers are thinking very differently. And I think, you know, when they do interact in a store, the experience has got to be so spot on. If they've shipped their bodies into a shop, then, you know, they're highly critical. So the service expectations have just gone up so exponentially. So the only way to meet those expectations is to have this hybrid of the experience that's supported by digital information.
Yeah, I agree. I'm being a little bit selfish here, but I'm also thinking through this whole collaboration and partnerships, because partnerships with data houses, partnerships with delivery services, getting this full end-to-end experience. And there's skill sets that are, as you rightfully say, and Anastasia touches on, that are asking retailers to be a very different model. You know, if I think about even getting product into people's homes.
No, very true. And I noticed in one of the Q&As, somebody asked about Australia Post. I'll quickly explain. Australia Post are a member of the ARA, but the you know, they've to defend them slightly. Imagine waking up one day and having Christmas expectations every day, and it's been like that for 6 months.
Yeah.
They've not been able to plan for it. It just came from nowhere. So that's what they're dealing with. I'm not making excuses. I'm just saying that's the reality of what they're dealing with. Now, I think the next move for retailers, which is the Amazon model, is to own the full end-to-end, and that includes the delivery. So when you're big enough as an industry, or where you've got the logistics right, that you can own the whole experience from end to end, because often the poor experience from online, majority of it is because of the delivery, not because of the pick, packing and dispatching. It's the fact that it's sat somewhere in a warehouse post that process and didn't get to the customer on time, or they've decided to send it to the post office and you're going through all that sort of shenanigans. So,
true.
You know.
Very true. Anastasia, are there any questions for Paul at this point?
Yeah, I'm sorry, bear with me a second. So any analysis as to the effect of the Vic lockdowns on the broader economy?
Well, look, that work has commenced. So it's in the billions, I can tell you that, of course. Most of you would know or may not know that 25%, so a quarter of the $340 billion of Australian retail comes from Victoria. It's also the logistics capital of the country. So the impact is significant. And that will be their Achilles heel now, I guess, through the recovery, and the recovery will be slow. I think what we'll see when we look at the media today, there'll be pent up demand and we'll see people shopping. But my view in retail is if you lose the sale, you lose the sale. It doesn't come back. You know, there's been suppressed shopping, so that'll play out in retail, but equally, many of those Victorians now be thinking about, do I have a job? You know, do I have a job post-Christmas? So there's a whole issue in consumer confidence that'll play out, I think, post-Christmas, that'll play into people's mindset.
I think it's interesting how you mentioned, you know, Vic is the logistics hub. I think that's one of the key things. It's not just affecting Victorian retail, it's affecting every single state.
It is, absolutely.
Applied channel issues. And one more question for you, Paul. Do you think consumers will begin to move towards the wholesale manufacturer, leaving retailers out of the loop?
Well, look, we could do a whole session on this. There's definitely, seeing your image as a Kit Kat, I think you're seeing a lot of the middlemen starting to be cut out, which is why you'll find department stores are struggling and have been. And it's because the middlemen are being slowly cut out. And there's this whole model of direct to consumer. Now, just quickly, my favorite drink is kombucha at the moment because it has probiotics in it, and it helps me to have a healthy lifestyle. And I got onto, and the brand is Remedy. I got online to check out what their website looked like, and they're doing direct to consumer on a subscription model. You can get a case delivered. I'm not being paid by Remedy, by the way, but I'm just saying, that can be delivered to my door in my apartment in Sydney every week, and I don't have to think about it again. So a lot of the subscriptions that I've gone into, coffee's another good example. I just know what my needs are, and there's this massive move to direct to consumer, which will be a long haul, but there's this quiet movement just happening that's going to hit everybody pretty soon.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's it. How they can link smartly to convenience.
Well, Paul, again, thank you very much. It's a really impressive dissertation and for your time. So great to have you with us. Paul.
What's that?
I look forward to the next time as well.
Absolutely, no problem. Hopefully I'll be a bit more available next time for you. So no worries at all. Okay, see you guys. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Paul. I'd like to introduce us now to Derek Wyllie, and I touched on Derek before as the APAC commercial director for Doc Martens, and Derek's been a great ally and colleague and friend of Retail Doctor Group. And Doc Martens, for those who know the Doc Martens story, it's worth even going on their website and having a look at the history of Doc Martens. A remarkable story of brand transformation, a remarkable story of cross-generational transformation. I can recall walking through Covent Garden in the UK and seeing a magnificent small 3-level story and homage to the brand. And that's always kept me in touch. So Derek, delighted you could be with us. And we really wanted to get a bit of a view from you today on COVID, post-COVID, the retail leader's perspective. So good morning and thank you from Hong Kong, I think.
Yeah, good morning, Brian. Dawn's just breaking here in Hong Kong, so it's starting to get light outside. Well, thanks for the Retail Doctor team for affording me the opportunity to share some insight on retail from a regional perspective. I think everybody said none of us have faced a situation like this, and there's no real end in sight. But as retailers, we are nothing if not resilient, and as an industry, I think we've been adapting well, as Paul has mentioned, and in many different ways across the region. When we spoke about me coming on to present, Melbourne was just entering the most recent lockdown, and conditions in Hong Kong were rather more severe than they are now. We're now some weeks on, the situation has continued to evolve and develop, and our businesses have also had to do the same. So I'll start by giving a brief overview of the region and some of the phenomena we are seeing before talking about life in the stores. Then I'll go on to talk about the landlord-tenant relationship and how this has matured as we have dealt with these extraordinary challenges. And finally, we'll look to the future and the themes that are emerging. And I think you'll hear a lot of me talking about things that Anastasia and Paul have already talked about. So globally, APAC was the first to be affected by this pandemic, and meaning many of us were pioneers in figuring out what needed to be done to keep businesses trading and our staffs and customers safe. I believe that cooperation has been particularly strong, even between competitors as well as many different stakeholders. With the exception of Australia, New Zealand and Japan, Dr. Martens' retail presence is dominated by monobrand. So whether directly operated by us or through our partners, I think one of the strengths has been retail coming together, and we're working with strong operators across many markets we work in. And we've been genuinely able to learn from each other. And much of this know-how garnered here was then shared with teams in Europe, Middle East, Africa, and North America, who began to face into these issues much later. In the early stages, when much less was known about this virus, drop-offs in traffic were much more noticeable in the city centre locations compared to suburban ones. Some of this was possibly driven by fear of coming into crowded places, which turned out to be less crowded, ironically, and also the rise in the working from home. While this has rebalanced somewhat, our suburban stores have remained relatively stronger in Hong Kong at least, with tourism all but stopped, and are now seen as strategically more important. For strong businesses, there are some great opportunities to relocate some stores and some prime shopping areas to better locations within the centre. So as you can see in this diagram, I've borrowed this from McKinsey in terms of the strategic importance of stores and four-wall profitability. So we've got some stores which obviously are now low in profitability and low in strategic importance, and we're having to renegotiate or exit and to reduce our space and cut to fit. In terms of across the region, the key differentiator in our performance has been our customer profile pertinent in each market. So the likes of Taiwan, Indonesia, Australia, and New Zealand, we've very strong domestic demand. So I've generally been delivering some stellar business, supported through well-developed digital and e-com capability. Although we have strong domestic demand in the likes of the Philippines and Malaysia, the extent of lockdown and the relative lack of digital presence for Dr. Martens has made this a tougher time in these markets. For Hong Kong, as I've mentioned, we're reviewing our store estate, similar to the McKinsey suggested approach in the diagram. Hong Kong and Thailand, in contrast, rely to a much larger extent on tourists, and this has given different challenges. Prior to COVID, I actually commissioned some work to look at e-commerce market development in the region. So in the next slide, you'll see a chart which shows the relative share of footwear online in 2019 compared to what it's predicted to be in 2023, and also the size of the leather footwear market in the yellow bands. At Dr. Martens, we're fortunate that the top leather footwear markets I cover are also heavily driven by domestic demand, so the figures are not looking too bad for most of my business. But markets like Singapore, where e-commerce has not been significant in the past across many sectors, has seen higher levels of adoption. The same has also been true of Hong Kong, where customers like to get out of their small apartments and go and shop. So physical retail in Hong Kong is actually very important for mental well-being, especially when our customers are staying in a very confined space. We've also launched social selling using WhatsApp and PayMe, and this is managed by our store teams in Hong Kong. It's still in its infancy and we're learning a lot, particularly in markets like Indonesia, where in Jakarta, our partner MAP have been doing a lot of social selling there as well, and also Viber in the Philippines. I think the key message here is, irrespective of sector, e-commerce is only going to grow, but traditional retail still has an important integrated role to play in selection and purchase. One of the biggest challenges we've faced is in setting achievable, motivating stretch targets for our store-based retail teams. We've been unable to control traffic. We've not been able to control sales per se. However, we can control staff incentives and also the store environments to make them as safe for customers and staff as possible, and in such a way that customers can see and tell that difference. About 18 months ago, Dr. Martens finally caught up with the IT age and invested in a product called Storeforce. It's actually supported out of Australia, incidentally, and this has helped us match our resources to the changing trading patterns. The busiest 20 hours in our stores normally account for more than 50% of turnover in a given week. Storeforce has helped us figure out the changing trading patterns and helping to roster to anticipated consumer demand. This has also led to increase in sales conversion, which has been higher than the drop-off in overall traffic. The statistics generated have also helped us understand each associate's KPIs and allowed us to effectively target training and coaching interventions, leading to optimized store performance in a suboptimal environment. We're now in the process of employee self-service gamification of the targets and KPIs like leaderboards, consecutive weeks of achieving the likes of units per transaction, average transaction values and sales targets, etc. And by having easy access to these data dashboards, we've also managed to improve the retail acumen of our store managers and driving improved job satisfaction along the way. And this has been quite a challenge because the stores have become quiet and sales have become hard to come by injecting training into these sort of quieter times and then giving the staff the tools to actually see performance and then actually, I guess, manage what they can measure and see the improvements. It certainly helped there a lot. The other huge benefit is the regular contact with Storeforce themselves, and we're actually supported out of Sydney, where we can share progress in some of the best practice from other speciality retailers across Australasia and particularly North America. With all the above, it's also been important to maintain strong retail discipline, such as size availability, never out of stocks, etc. And since the start of the pandemic, I guess like you have in Australia, we've provided our staff with masks and ready access to hand sanitizers. We've also suspended the sharing of staff between stores so that if there's an outbreak in one store, we can contain the impact and maintain trading in other locations. Customers are screened for temperature entering the mall, so we don't have to do that when they enter the store. And I must say, mask compliance in Hong Kong has been very strong. Moving on to this landlord-tenant relationship, this in Hong Kong has traditionally been an imbalanced one, with landlords holding the power. Hong Kong retailers have been on the ropes since July 2019, when the civil unrest began to take hold here. Tourist arrivals have been falling sharply since November, and in July were down 99.5%. Over 55 million tourists arrived in Hong Kong last year, and that's more than 9 times the number of people who actually live in the territory. So their spending is crucial to the many retail stores that we have. Some well-known international retail brands have decided to leave completely, while many others have significantly trimmed their networks. According to JLL, retail rents have tumbled by as much as 71% from their 2014 peaks in the 4 main locations of Central, Causeway Bay, Tsim Sha Tsui and Mongkok. This is actually taking rental rates back to 2006 levels, and vacancy rates in Causeway Bay have more than tripled to 11.5%. This is a similar story that we see repeated across the other key retail centres. Initially, landlords, while sometimes sympathetic to the civil unrest and also to COVID, seemed initially reluctant to engage. Fast forward 8 months, and many of the larger players, particularly the mall operators, have moved from agreeing reduced rental rates to working with tenants in joint-wide mall promotions. Spend X amount to get coupons towards 50% of your next purchase. And then in the next purchase, there's a further 50% of coupons as well. So rather than just give rental reductions to the retailer, what they've actually done is bought vouchers from the retailer at a slight discount and then shared some of the pain the discounts and actually stimulated demand that was hitherto unthere. This is also spread across F&B, where malls like Times Square have been giving F&B vouchers also to the value of 50% to enable customers to enjoy food and eating out there as well. With no travel and meals restricted to 4 people, many of the wealthier Hong Kongers are really taking advantage. And this has been helpful for luxury as well. You can't typically redeem coupons in their boutiques, you can earn them, which pushes second iteration demand to brands such as ourselves and still preserves the overall pricing architecture. And this has been really important in stimulating the economy. So we haven't had in Hong Kong the same sort of stimulus that Paul spoke about in terms of your JobKeeper and JobSeeker in Australia, but the malls have been playing a very important part in stimulating the local demand. So in summary, it seems clear that increased digital presence and online sales are here to stay, even in markets like Hong Kong and Singapore, which have been very slow to go on the bandwagon. Customers do still seem to value human engagement and interaction, and I think this will continue. Omnichannel capability will be the key. This also ties into the development of social selling in the likes of Facebook, WhatsApp, WeChat and Viber. It may be that we need to also train our store staff to interact with our customer in these media too, as well as in person. For Hong Kong in particular, many retailers are seeing a need to pay more attention to local consumers rather than the high rollers from mainland China and elsewhere. And this may see neighbourhood malls get more attention in the coming years and take pressure off traditional tourist hotspots in Central, Tsim Sha Tsui and Causeway Bay. And finally, I think four-wall retailing is far from dead. There will be an increased onus on making sure every customer interaction in the shop floor counts. Traffic may be depressed for some time, but customers coming to stores could be said to be risking their lives to buy, and we need to be well equipped to serve them to make sure their journey to our store was worthwhile. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Derek. That was a great summary and really interesting to understand the regional aspects. I do have a question, if I may, and then Anastasia may have some from Q&A. The sort of the piece that's interesting is when I come into a shop, I deal with a sales associate operationally. Product's not in stock that I want, but it is online. Are the sales associates easily moving between the two mediums, going online and organising it, or is it this chest out of, well, there's nothing in it for them, they don't do it?
We're beginning to get better at that. I think we've been quite slow from Dr. Martens' point of view in Hong Kong because the investment hasn't really been here because we've not really needed it before. But what we are seeing is using communications like WhatsApp, PayMe, and the shop assistants are then, arranging for the stock to be delivered to the customer from the warehouse, and the store is being credited with the sale. But because although we've been quite good at predicting what the overall demand is going to be like in Hong Kong, what we've not managed to do is actually get it down to store level. So for this time, we've been giving our teams a more pooled targets in terms of sales, and that's, I think, helped drive some of that behaviour. So it's not specifically tied to them.
And it's interesting when I think about the landlord relationship, which Simon from Leaseinfo will follow. The piece around, in that example, I've ordered my Doc Marten boots online, physically through the store. You've made the comment the store gets the sales, but that's not always the case, is it? It's all down to the respective brands and their treatment. Some would say that's an online purchase. Some would say it's physical store. So I suppose ultimately it doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah, ultimately, I guess it doesn't. I mean, I guess the issue for us is we don't have an online drmartens.com.hk flat sale to go to, so it has to go somewhere. So maybe it's more by accident than design, Brian, in fairness.
Yeah. And do you still see physical store expansion on the horizon once we get through COVID and what have you?
Yeah, for Dr. Martens, we very much do. I mean, I think we're very much committed to direct to consumer. I think our store profile will change. You know, do we still need 2 stores in Chim Sa Choi, for example? I think a better located store within the key centre would be better, and there's certainly opportunity for that. And we're beginning to look more at neighbourhood malls in some of the outlying, Hong Kong's not that big, but in the new territories outside. And that's also giving us cause to think about our wholesale model. You know, is it better for us to maybe move into some of these places where traditionally wholesale has served for us? So a few strategic questions being asked and hopefully being answered in the next 12 to 18 months.
And finally, one of the pieces I liked in visiting the stores pre-COVID was this lovely piece around heritage and brand ethos and the story of Doc Martens, and bringing much more animation and theatre to the stores. And I guess you'd see that as an important part of physical retail going forward.
Absolutely, and I think that what we seem to see, and from my talk to my colleagues in other businesses and brands, the brands that seem to have performed slightly better in the categories that haven't been as badly affected are the brands that people resonate with, and that store experience is your best opportunity to get that resonation with your customers.
Yeah, and I can't help that. I guess you're absolutely right, and we haven't talked a lot about it today, but this concept of brand to consumer and the role of increasing importance of brand and the story and the attributes and what it means to be part of that tribe, to be part of the Doc Martens tribe, and then all the data that's needed to grow that tribe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we obviously our heritage, we still talk about that a lot of times. A lot of the pictures you see of Dr. Martens are still from the 60s, and these iconic images, you know, from the rock and roll and punk era. And we are sort of slowly evolving and trying to stay. I think the challenge for a brand like us at the moment is to try and stay cool to the new generation, you know, and have the fathers and mothers wearing the same footwear, you know, and I think that's a bit of a challenge.
Well, that was the challenge. That is the challenge, and has been the challenge for the surf retail industry. Comes to mind, you know, would I be wearing the same branded outfit my dad wore type stuff? And absolutely, but there is that ethos of the brand. Derek, thank you very much. We're grateful to you this morning. We're also grateful for the fact that you probably got up at 5 a.m. to be here. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Brian.
Be back in touch.
Cheers.
And thank you very much. Our next presenter is indeed a friend and a great friend of Retail Doctor Group. Recommend the work of Leaseinfo highly. Simon, I've introduced you, I think, 8 times now, and you continue to impress. So good morning.
Thank you very much, Brian. I presume you can all hear me.
Mm-hmm.
I would like to just start by, before I get into my presentation, just to talk a little bit about very interesting discussion, particularly about what Paul was saying about leasing. That leasing is now probably number 1 or number 2 in all boards, big company board positions on what to do. And unfortunately, the whole leasing space has really changed, and one of the areas that really is not being talked about but has been alluded to this morning is risk and risk capital. As a retailer, risk profile has actually substantially changed in some sectors, and Paul, you know, alluded to that in his intro about, you know, say fashion, footwear. So there's a lot of discussion around risk, and also the landlords are also in the same issue, but in a reverse situation where their model is suddenly risky as well. So the risk and the repricing of capital, which then affects rents, is a key consideration for both parties. And this sort of tension is going to continue to play out probably over the next 5 to 7 years. It's unlikely to be a short-term thing. because the business models of a lot of retailers are evolving, and same with the shopping centres. Their business models evolving as well. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you an update on where we're at with some of the changes in terms of legislation. It's very much focused on what's happening domestically. So I'm going to start with an update on what each state has done with their temporary COVID legislation. So if you move, Anastasia, to the first slide. So you should be able to see this state extension slide. So unfortunately, the governments of each state have not acted uniformly. You can understand why Victoria has done something sort of a little bit different, but as you can see, Victoria has enacted the tenant protection legislation to the end of the year, but they've allowed an extension to 26th of April. So that's like an option. South Australia has basically unilaterally gone to 28th of March without actually even considering an interim step. So that's, again, interesting. ACT's gone to the 31st of January. WA is to the same as South Australia. Queensland's the 31st of December, and New South Wales is the 31st of December. Now, a lot of the retailers and landlords are quite confused by all this, which, I don't blame them, because you've got a situation where these periods don't necessarily match the JobKeeper program. So the JobKeeper program is supposed to end on the 28th of March, but yet you've got different dates now for the rent relief. So I guess the summary of it all is you need to keep up. If you're a retailer and you're multi-site, you really need to be on top of each state's legislation, and you need to keep on watching what they're doing, because it seems to be a moving target. The other thing that's changed, which has probably been well publicised, so if you move to the next slide, Anastasia, the Corporations Act has changed, which again is similar to the Chapter 11 provisions in the USA. And what it means is that SMEs will be able to sort of protect, the directors are protected up until the 31st of December 2020. Now, that hasn't stopped, unfortunately, a couple of high-profile retailers declaring, going into liquidation. We heard yesterday, really sad that Riot Art and Craft has gone, which it's been a long time client. We're very sad about that. So it's not preventing that, but it's sort of, I think, delaying the inevitable. That, as Paul Zahra mentioned, that maybe 50% of SME retailers may not re-emerge. I think that figure is probably too high. I would suggest that it wouldn't be as high as that, but certainly there'll be post Christmas. There will be a number of retailers, if that's not extended, that a lot of some retailers and other small businesses will basically liquidate and not continue. Whether or not also that becomes, as a side, it might prompt a change permanently where, a sort of Chapter 11 style option is available to small to medium-sized companies. That could well occur, because obviously we're in a recession. It's going to take 5 to 7 years for SMEs to sort of recover. So because of the government wants, more risk taking, they may well extend this protections on an ongoing basis, just to allow retailers to fail, and if they do fail, to fail fast, but they're not basically completely gutted. So watch that space in terms of what they do. Next slide is the, as I mentioned, this is all very well known. The JobKeeper has extended to the 28th of March. There's a retesting on the 31st, by the 31st of December. So this is referring to JobKeeper 2.0. Most of the state-based legislation now still refers to JobKeeper. So if you're in JobKeeper 2, those state-based legislation will apply as well. So again, watch this space again. They may well extend JobKeeper past the 31st of March. It wouldn't surprise me at all that for certain sectors like tourism, travel, even certain parts of hospitality, they may be industry specific. But obviously I'm not in Treasury, so I can't predict, but it wouldn't surprise me at all that we get sector specific JobKeeper post 31st of March. Just to, if you can move to the next slide, Anastasia, just to confuse people even further, the government, the federal government has basically said that the pandemic period is now extended to the 17th of December. So that's that mandatory code of conduct that Morrison talked about. That's now has an end of the 17th of December. Why they chose that date, I don't know. But the important thing to understand is that is the minimum date, and they may well extend that again. So again, you need to keep watching what the governments are doing closely, and make sure that you're aware as a retailer of what trigger dates are in play, because it can affect your lease negotiation position. So just lastly, I'm going to talk about one court case, which, Anastasia, if you can just go to the last slide, just one interesting court case, which is called the Sneaker Boy case, which is in the New South Wales Supreme Court. So this was a situation where a tenant was actually behind on the rent before the pandemic hit. So they were actually in default, but they applied, the tenant applied, and the landlords sought to terminate the lease. And the landlord basically was prevented from doing that because of the Supreme Court ruled that the pandemic period basically should allow the retailer to continue to trade, even if they were in default prior to the pandemic starting. So there were a lot of retailers already in arrears prior to the pandemic. So a lot of, particularly in certain sectors. So this is actually a major case for retailers and landlords to be aware of, that a landlord can't necessarily just terminate, even if the tenant was in default prior to the pandemic hitting. So again, something to be aware of if that applies to you. And that is it in terms of a legislation and court case update. Hope that's been of help, and I shall pass it back to Brian.
Thanks very much, Simon. That's a great summary. It's really interesting, and you're absolutely correct. The property, the consolidation of space was starting to occur pre-COVID anyway. And we knew that Australia was third highest per capita, as we've often said. So that was always going to happen. Where do you see it where do you see it playing out, Simon, in the next couple of years? What do you think it looks like in 2023 for the sake of discussion?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you're going to, like Paul said, that you've got I would call it a trifurcation of the retail market. So you've got a situation where certain shopping centres and certain retail groups are actually doing better than ever. So if you take sort of parts of regional Australia and certain, excluding Victoria, some of those shopping centres are actually trading really, really well. So that sector, the neighbourhood shopping centres are actually doing well. So there's been which we've already discussed in previous State of the Nations, that there's a move to the hyper-local economy, and that transition, that convenience that you already discussed previously, that's already starting to take place. So, that sector of the market is actually sort of somewhat benefited from COVID. Where the real issues are, and in the sort of CBDs, so the CBD retail, Paul mentioned 5 years for some sort of recovery. I suggest that I think that it's not going to be a matter of time. I think there's a sort of permanent change there, that there will be, because of the way that offices are going to work post-COVID, there will be a structural shift in the way that CBD retail works. Obviously, tourism will come back eventually, international and local, so that will partly offset any deterioration. But I still think that there's going to be a significant structural shift in the way that CBD retail works. So that's that sector, which is the middle. And then the third sector is the major large malls. So previously called fortress malls, they've sort of no longer fortress. So these very large malls with very large, with exposure to the sectors that are most impacted, namely fashion, apparel, footwear, other types of services, those malls will need to basically rejig their business models, and they will need to repurpose and consolidate some of their space into areas that are much more immune from discretionary retail. So I see a remixing towards essentials like medical, allied health, even things like childcare, community spaces, and much more of their business model will be around facilitating purchases. So making the retailer's ability to service online, click and collect, investing in technology, investing in delivery services, investing in, as you say, augmented reality, investing in convenience. So those are that's the trifurcation of the model that I see. Also, strip retail will also evolve, which I suppose is another sub-market that we will play out. But that's essentially what's going to happen. I see a lot of the shopping centres, some of the smaller ones will basically continue to do well, but I think there'll be a lot of divestment from some of the REITs for malls that they no longer wish to take the risk on. So I think there'll be a lot of buying and selling over the next cycle.
I think if I may, they're great points. The interesting thing that links to this is how assets, shopping centres particularly, will produce their revenue and yield models going forward. So this idea that we charge rent from physical product sold in shops is contracting. So Simon, your thoughts as to, for example, the role of data and asset managers producing a revenue from their, if you like, on leasing or on selling of data, utilities, thinking about communal hubs and the way that they bring people to a communal hub, of which there's retail, and that they produce a revenue stream that isn't reliant so much on the retailer's performance.
Yeah, I think that's inevitably what will happen, but I think that's going to be a slow burn. You know, that already some of the smarter retailers, some smarter landlords are already trying to create revenue streams off their, if you like, online infrastructure, so that, you know, where if it's a certain shopping centre type, that they have a sort of Uber Eats delivery system that the shopping centre runs, and the landlord charges a fee for that. And some of the very biggest landlords in the country are actually looking at that very, very much at the moment. So I see that as an evolving area. The main problem, Brian, is financiers, who typically are not the most imaginative of people. They have a real problem with that model, where now the shopping centre, I know this is inevitably where it's going to go, but shopping centres have traditionally, what they love is the low risk rent. So the shopping centre owners have basically been able to survive by pretty much, without being rude, just basically being able to clip the retailer's ticket at a low rent, and capitalising that rent at a very low yield, which means it's got a high perpetuity value. And that's worked really well for many, many years. And that's why finance has been readily available for these type of assets. However, if you're suddenly relying on 10, 20, maybe even 30% of your revenue coming from online or non-traditional rent, that has a significantly different risk to rent. And so therefore that pricing of it the financiers will have to get their head around, which they inevitably will, but it's just going to be a lot of sorting out and a lot of basically tension around the business model of shopping centres going forward. But inevitably they're going to, if they want to keep going and survive, they're going to have to move with the times.
Yeah, I think we have some very smart asset managers and shopping centre owners and managers, but I do think, as you do, Simon, this is ultimately the elephant in the room.
Yeah.
And as you rightfully say, it is progressing. In the time remaining, Anastasia, do we have any questions for?
So I just want to open it up to Q&A. So there's a couple here, but if anyone else has got any that they'd like to quickly put in, we've probably only got about 5 minutes left, so we'll run through a couple. There's a lot of questions that have come up today around supply chain. So how do you see the supply chain moving forward? So maybe this is for Derek, possibly, about how do we see changes to the supply chain in retail?
Yeah, good question. I think it's a challenge. It's one we're trying to face in Hong Kong. I think, is the question more to do with the supply chain in terms of its length, or in terms of how it's structured?
Yeah, how it's structured, I think, and how we maybe see what the major changes there, because obviously, you know, one of the things we are seeing in Australia is the impact of the supply chain is having out of stocks coming from different states, reliance on different countries. You'll be seeing that as well with the reliance between Hong Kong and China. So do we see that changing? Do we see major changes to the way it's structured?
I think so. I think we've already started seeing that within our business. A lot more resilience put in there. So we're trying to change your routes of supply, different countries, and trying to make sure that you've got some diversity there. Obviously, for international business, like ours, we've got a lot of issues maybe with America and China trade wars and everything else, and potential duty hikes. Then we're having to get some sort of resilience in there as well. And obviously, keeping people manufacturing when there's outbreaks of COVID in some markets or some countries has been interesting as well. So we've certainly seen that, and I think that will still continue. I think it's a diverse supply chain, and then I think the economy, the challenge there to keep economies of scale while keeping the supply chain diverse.
Fantastic, thank you. Then you have one question here. This is maybe more for Simon. What have you seen a fall in rental for commercial and retail rentals? Is there any average numbers you're seeing across the board, or is it very varied by sector, negotiation, retailer?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. It's very much dependent on each sector. A lot of deals actually aren't. There's not a lot of deals at the moment actually getting done. A lot of the retailers and landlords are still dealing with COVID, and as you've heard, that they've extended the COVID legislation mostly till the end of the year. So there's not a lot of activity in terms of new deals. I've done a few. You know, some of them are basically we're getting for the retailer who's got a good business and is prepared to look for the next 5 years. There's some very good deals we've done. You know, we've had some significant reductions. The landlords have actually been willing to and actually been very accommodating on some of them. But in terms of the CBD non-prime CBD rents, so I'm not talking about like Pitt Street Mall. I'm talking more around, you know, these non-prime CBD retail rents. There is significant distress in those areas, and you know, a lot of the activity is on hold. So there's the actual ability to gauge how far it's dropped is somewhat moot because we haven't actually got any heavy data yet to say, okay, well, it's fallen by this and that. I think you'll start to see more data come out by the 31st of March next year, where some of the deals get concluded. So at this stage, there is no, JLL have done some studies on, you know, where they're predicting the market could fall by X or Y. I haven't got any hard data yet. The only data I've got is the information we have in our own database. And in some of the centres that we're tracking, particularly in neighbourhood and sub-regional centres, believe it or not, the rent's actually gone up for some of the, particularly in pharmacy, the rents have gone up in pharmacy. In fashion, some of the deals have obviously gone down, but it's really a mixed bag in terms of what category you're in, where the asset's located. But I think that by the 31st of March next year, we should start to see a lot more data come through, and we're able to gauge the quantum of where the market is.
Perfect. Yeah. Given the time, we have actually reached 10 o'clock, so I'm just going to have to wrap it up there, as I know everyone's got other commitments. So a huge thank you to our speakers. So thank you, Derek, thank you, Simon, and thank you to Paul. And from Retail Doctor Group, we will be in contact to share recording from today. Our consumer research will also be available for download over the next week. And also we are launching, or we have launched within the last month, the 2020 Australian Retail Innovators. So fantastic year last year for those that were the finalists. So it's called for nominations. So you can nominate in any one of our 7 categories. So our new category of FMCG. You can find the nomination link on this page, but you can also feel free to email me and I can share the nomination link, or it's also on our website and on our social media. So follow us on LinkedIn. So yeah, 7 categories this year. So you can nominate yourself, you can nominate somebody else. Any questions at all, just get in contact. The nominations will be open for a couple more weeks. And then yeah, we'll be closing and finalists will be announced early 2021. So thank you everyone for participating and for listening today. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much. I was just going to say we continue to have great appreciation to our panelists, to everyone who contributes. We continue to build the best possible omni-channel retail that we can and do that successfully. So please let us know where we can help you there. Thanks, Anastasia. Great presentation. Paul, Simon and Derek. Grateful, and to everyone who tuned in. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys.